Friday is the deadline for nominations to be on the steering committee. I know that you're all enthused to serve the Emeritus Academy, and we may have more than we can handle, but I'm still soliciting some more. And if we don't get enough, we go out and solicit you personally, and that's difficult. That's how they got me on it. So I figure I can return the favor someday as well. So that's Friday. April 1st will be the 5-year membership renewal deadline. You should get a communication about that situation if you're up for your 5-year renewal. And April 1st is also the deadline for next year's lecture proposals. So you have 8 lectures a year, and first one is in September, if I'm not mistaken. And if you have a topic that you'd like to speak on, particularly if you're a new member of the organization, feel free to propose it as a lecture. The information on how to do that and the requirements is online. And we take into account what months you're available as well, because we have to coordinate that with everybody. So we'll talk about that next month. The deadline is April 1st. Newsletter submissions for the spring edition are due April 25th. And lastly, the spring small grant applications deadline is May 2nd. We have a fair amount of money available for the spring grant program this year, more than usual. And so I would encourage you to submit any proposals you have. And again, the rules for doing that are online. So today, we have a talk by Dr. Robert DiSilvestro. He is Professor Emeritus of Human Nutrition at OSU. He earned his BS in biochemistry from Purdue and his PhD in biochemistry from Texas A&M. His research evolved from metalloprotein biochemistry and physiology to a variety of practical nutrition and nutraceutical issues. He remains active in research and has tried his hand at commercial product development. Not successful yet, but still interested. And he also has a blog at nutritionprofbob.com. Doctor, look forward to your talk on vitamin D. Thank you.
Yes, as mentioned there, it's interesting how twists and turns take place in careers. My early research as an assistant professor was things like looking for the molecular weight for a copper zinc enzyme variant. And then gradually over the years, I got into more applied nutrition areas, both in research teaching and then tried a little bit of entrepreneurialism. Haven't given up on that, although my first experience was not overly pleasant. So anyway, vitamin D is an interesting one. I've done a little work on it. It's not my primary area of research, but I have incorporated it into a number of my studies. And I want to go back a ways. Let's see if I got this working. Now, that's the pointer. Yeah, let's go back to 1985. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue and been handed a syllabus that said teach intro nutrition for our majors and related majors, and I'm making it up as I go along. And I get to vitamin D and I say, how am I going to fill up 15 or 20 minutes on vitamin D? I could tell them a little about rickets or osteomalacia, but gosh, that's going to have to stretch it to fill in the time. Fast forward, my last semester teaching at Ohio State, I'm teaching that same sort of course, and I'm like, how am I going to only give 20 minutes to vitamin D? So things have changed a lot. What changed? I think 2 things. One was something that had been around, but nobody seemed to notice much. There's not a lot of easy ways to get vitamin D. One way is from the sun, and in case you don't understand this, there's not like little vitamin Ds that float down from the sun. Basically what happens is there's a compound in your skin, and when the radiation from the sun hits that compound in the skin, it turns it into a form of vitamin D. And you don't need to fry to do that. 15 minutes on your face, a short sleeve shirt, that's enough to get pretty much a day's worth of vitamin D if the sun is strong enough. Today in Ohio, you're not going to get any vitamin D out there. So that's one way people can get vitamin D, there are not a lot of natural food sources. There's some in mushrooms. You have to eat liver, you can get it that way. Most of us don't do that very much, but that's a way to do it. Certain seafood, it depends on the particular seafood, but rainbow trout and salmon happen to be particularly good. So there are certain seafoods that will give you vitamin D. There's a little in dairy, and then some dairies are also fortified with some extra, and then you could pop a pill. But there's not a lot of natural sources, and for some reason, it just suddenly dawned on people one day that, gosh, I wonder if people eat that much vitamin D or get that much, either from sun or from their diet. That was one thing that changed. Also, early on, we thought of vitamin D primarily for just getting calcium out of your digestive system into your bloodstream, and then getting out of your bones to go to other places when it was needed, when you weren't getting enough from your diet. And that's pretty much what we thought of. Well, all of a sudden, people started figuring out that vitamin D can affect a whole lot of processes in the body. So between realizing that a lot of people were not getting that much vitamin D, either from the sun or from diet, and realizing it could affect a whole lot of processes, suddenly vitamin D became a rage. And there was a deluge of research that was done. Unfortunately, the deluge of research has not answered very many questions. Now, give a little spoiler alert. This has been quite a challenge untangling all the background on vitamin D. And I have to say that it's kind of a mess, but I'm not going to just end right now. By the end, I will at least make what I think are some educated, I won't call them guesses, but educated propositions about vitamin D, and really distill everything down to 2 recommendations. But I'll tell you right now, there's a lot more questions than answers out there. Why is that? I'll get to that shortly. My talk, I'm going to break it up into four categories here. I'm going to just briefly tell you what is vitamin D, and then talk a little, I'm not going to beat this into the ground, but I'll talk a little about what are the problems of doing studies on vitamin D. Why don't we have better answers? And then I'll just go through a few results that seem to be positive. There's lots of negative ones out there too, but I'll talk about some of the ones that suggest vitamin D can be useful for some things. Again, just a brief overview, because there's so many different areas I could be talking about, and then end with a very simple recommendation. So what is vitamin D? Well, first of all, it's a steroid. And if you say that to a biochemist, they'll answer, oh yeah, it means it has a structure that looks something like cholesterol. You say that to the average person on the street, and they're like thinking bodybuilders, Barry Bonds, Mark McGuire, people like that. Or maybe they're thinking of older people, not us, older people, injecting themselves with steroids when they have inflammation. And that's true, but steroid, in terms of a chemical definition, just means it has a structure that's something like cholesterol. So if you took any vitamin D today, you did steroids. What does it do? It forms hormones. Hormones are signaling molecules that are made in one part of the body to tell somewhere else in the body to do something. So vitamin D is made into a number of hormones. Its classic function, at least in terms of what's been known for the longest time, is that it moves calcium, moves it out of the digestive system into our bloodstream, and then moves it around in the body, tells tissues take up calcium, take some out of bone, put some over here. But there's other actions that vitamin D has that go beyond calcium. Now, moving calcium is important not just for bones. Calcium actually acts as a messenger in cells to go from one part of a cell to another and say, hey, do this, turn this up, turn this down. So affecting calcium does more than affect bones and teeth. And then there's also other actions that don't seem to need calcium. So vitamin D has all these hormone functions that could affect just an enormous number of processes in the body. And, as I mentioned, that oftentimes people don't seem to get really large amounts from the sun or through diet. So there's been a big interest in the idea of supplementing. Now, even if there's nothing going on with you that raise your vitamin D needs, it's still very possible not to get enough vitamin D. But it can be made worse by some conditions. This is just a few examples. There are some conditions that make it even harder to get enough vitamin D because it seems to raise your vitamin D requirements. Fat malabsorption is one. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble compound. So normally, when you eat vitamin D, it's absorbed best if there's some fat in the meal too to help carry it in. You can get some in without the fat, but the most efficient way to get the vitamin D in is to have the vitamin D ingested with some fat in the meal. But if there's fat malabsorption, such as happens with cystic fibrosis or bariatric surgery, one of my business, I don't want to say failures, educational experiences, I made a protein-based support product for people who have had weight loss bariatric surgery. It was the best product in the world they could have possibly bought, and they didn't care. So any of you in marketing, I can talk to you later about my expensive lesson in marketing that I learned from that experience. But for them, I actually used the version of vitamin D that is real vitamin D, but it's mixed with some things that make it mix in water better. So in these people, the hope was that it would get absorbed with the water rather than with the fat because they have trouble with the fat. I'm about to start another study with cystic fibrosis patients. We're trying that same kind of vitamin D and seeing if it'll work well with them because they sometimes have fat malabsorption problems. Obesity can make vitamin D needs go up because a lot of the vitamin D ends up in fat reservoirs and doesn't get to where it's going. So you see you need more vitamin D in the whole body to cover what ends up in the fat tissue, plus what needs to go other places to do its job. Again, none of us are concerned about that, but older age. And then one other example, PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, they're becoming very popular, like Nexium. I put a lot of question marks there because I only found one study on it. It basically said that people on PPI seem to have lower vitamin D levels in their blood than other people, but they didn't correct for age. I think they may have only been seeing that getting older had an effect on vitamin D status. So jury's still out on that one, but there's others as well. So there are some situations that could actually increase vitamin D needs. All right, how do we know our body status? There's some nutrients that it's really hard to tell when you have small changes. I do some work with magnesium. That's a nightmare sometimes to figure out small changes in body functional status. Vitamin D, the good news is we have something we can measure. The bad news is people are fighting about what's a good reading. So what's normally measured, it's not a perfect indicator, but it's respectable. And it's plasma or serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D. So if you go get this measured in a doctor's office, they usually do it as nanograms per mil. Sometimes in papers, they do it as micromolar, which annoys me because that's not how you measure it in a lab. But that's, I don't know, some papers think it's cool to make everybody use those units. So what people have somewhat settled on, but fight about a lot, is what I have here. So adequate would be 30 nanograms per mil or more. Insufficient, not really super deficient, but maybe not optimal, would be 20 to 29. Then deficient would be less than 20. Looks good up there. Lots of people disagree on that. But that's what's come out. In fact, recently, one group, they call themselves the Endocrine Society, and they've even said, let's stop measuring vitamin D. It's being overblown. And some physicians have thought that's a good idea, but I kind of like the idea of having it measured. Even if we're not totally sure what the numbers mean, it gives us some ballpark idea. So some people like this Endocrine Society are saying, no, 20 is not even the cutoff for deficiency. You got to even get way below that, maybe down to 12 or 13 before it's deficient. Then there's some other people, particularly people on the internet with questionable credentials who are saying, nah, 30 is way too low. You got to get up to 50, 60, even go for 80. One of them is at Boston University School of Medicine. So he's not one of the ones with questionable credentials, though I somewhat question his conclusions. But Michael Hollick is saying, let's go up much higher than this. And I'll talk just a little about that here as I go along, but that's where we are with there's these different cutoffs and people disagree as to what they mean. So there are two kinds of studies basically that are done here in a broad sense. One is association studies. I was going to make some bad joke about not the music group that made Cherish, and not because it was funny, just because you'd understand it. I learned fairly early in my career not to make dated jokes when students were younger than I did. And at one time, they were upset about a test that was scheduled on a certain day because they had other tests. And I tried to see if maybe we could move it around, but of course, everyone disagreed on what date they wanted it. So I said, we're just leaving it in the first place. And people were upset. I saw it could be worse. My mother, the car could be coming back on TV. And I looked out, and one older, non-traditional student laughed. So anyway, I'll try not to make any dated jokes. That's my one attempt there. The association here is not referring to the music group, but these are studies that look at association. So for example, it might say people that take vitamin D supplements, people that get a lot of sun, people whose serum levels are in one of the good ranges or not in one of the good ranges. What do we see when we look for associations? Now, associations are valuable because they look at people in their real life states, but there's a problem with that. And I bet most of you already know. Someone want to tell me what's the problem with using associations? Cause and effect, that it could be completely coincidental. Particularly when you're looking at segments of society in other countries, maybe the people that are in the sun are the ones that are out on the beach and they're wealthier, or maybe the people in the sun are the ones that are not wealthier. They maybe don't have as much money to buy some other stuff. And then, there's just different things. There's just different ways of trying to look at that. So that's the hard part of it. Then there's intervention where you actually do something, have a person get some sun, give vitamin D supplements, then you do things that way. Now, unfortunately, these studies have not given us as many concrete answers as I would like. One reason is there's been inconsistent lab standardization, and that's still true today, although it's getting better. So you look at a paper from 1992, and it'll say, well, people with these blood levels, this is what we got. And a different lab might have done those same samples and got completely different results. So that's been a problem that is clearing up, but is still not fully there. So that's made a mess of going back and looking at old data and saying, well, if they said that their readings averaged 25 nanograms per mil, was it really 25? Was it 20? Was it 30? So that's complicated the whole issue a little bit. Also, all of these, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I don't know, there's sort of a rule, I don't know, particularly biochemists, that you got to put up one slide that nobody could read all of it in the time you leave it up. So here's my token slide for that. This is some of the many things that make it complicated. And for example, the kind of issues being looked at are multifactorial. That's a fancy way of saying a lot's going on. I mean, back in the olden days, if you wanted to say, what cures scurvy or prevents scurvy? Vitamin C. What else does it? Nothing. You got one vitamin, one condition. The kinds of things that vitamin D is being looked at for, it's not that simple. You look at something like cancer or heart disease. There's all kinds of stuff going on. So that means there's all kinds of different ways to do a study, and that can make things complex. Doses and timing, how much do you give? Do you give enough to be effective? Do you give too much? Also, it looks like, although sometimes people in clinical practice will give big shots of vitamin D because you store it, and that does work, but some research are saying it's really better to spread it out and give smaller, just take something every day. Although compliance-wise, if you can get a person to come in and get an injection once a month, it's sometimes easier to get them than getting them to take something every day. But it looks like the dosing works a little better when you spread it out. Other nutrients are involved, like calcium, body makeup, just all kinds of different things are happening at the same time. There's also another issue that comes up with vitamin D that doesn't come up as much with some other nutrients. If make believe that y-axis is some good thing, it's some measurement you want high. And the x-axis here is dose. Up to a point, when you increase the vitamin D dose, you get a better effect. But for some effects of vitamin D, as you start to give more, you don't plateau. You actually go backwards, and you can actually get a negative effect. So picking out dose is extremely important. Yeah, I've done some studies with copper, for example, and a lot of people are moderately copper deficient, and the RDA is probably too low. But we've done studies, we give it a certain amount, and if the people, just one person's status went up this much, another went up that much, another went up this much, as long as we got them above a certain line, we pretty much normalized their copper status. Everything was good. But with vitamin D, it's not necessarily like that. If you give it to a group of people and you don't check what their vitamin D levels were to begin with, they're going to end up in all these different spots. And as it turns out with vitamin D, giving too much can actually be counterproductive. So that's one reason we sometimes get crazy results in studies. And there's others here. And as I said, I won't go through all of them. If any of you really want the slides, since I'm throwing a lot at you today, come up afterwards and I'll give you a card. You can email me. I'll send you the slides. Sometimes people do meta-analysis. Anyone here from departments of statistics? Anyone ever done a meta-analysis? A lot of these get done for vitamin D. I won't say they're worthless. I've never done them. Some of my studies have been in them. And for some reason, I get asked a lot to review journal article submissions on meta-analysis, even though I've never done one. And some of them are informative, but they kind of drive me crazy at other times. If you don't know what these are, and even if you do know what these are, here's what they are. Basically, you take a bunch of studies and put them together and do some statistical analysis and come out with a conclusion. Well, that's fine if the studies are fairly similar, but some of them are really different. For instance, I did something with calcium and weight loss, and my study was nothing like what Dr. Zemmel in Tennessee did, and yet they put both of our data together. He got an effect I didn't. Well, because we did it differently, but in a meta-analysis, they push them all together. So there's a lot of meta-analysis done for vitamin D, and I don't know how anyone can make any sense of them because many times the studies are just so different. Also, a lot of people have jumped into this and have done some less than stellar research that gums up the works. A lot of researchers are under the impression that studying nutrients, particularly supplements, is an easy thing to do. It's not. As I said, my early work was more basic. When I really got into human nutrition and human nutrition interventions, especially with nutraceuticals, where you're dealing with extracts and not just single compounds, I found out there's a lot of tricks to it. It's not as simple as it sounds. For example, I'm not going to name the paper or the authors, but 2 papers in the last 5 years or so came out of Cleveland Clinic that were published in very prominent medical journals on supplements, and they were terrible. They were absolutely terrible. And I thought about writing a letter to the editor, but I thought back to the last time I did that, and a letter to the editor, I thought, I don't want to go through that again. So I just let it go. I actually contacted one of the authors, and we started talking about something else, and she said, well, we didn't ever talk about what you called about with the paper. Let's get back together again, but it never happened. So doing supplement studies and nutrient studies is not always that simple. There's just a lot of things that go on to do them right, and some people have not done a good job of it. In other cases, the subject itself was very complicated, but they also made it worse by not paying attention to some of the things. So we have this deluge of data out there. So let's talk about a few real studies. This is one of mine. This is not one that's going to ever win me any awards. It was published in an okay journal, not a predactory journal. An okay journal doesn't exist anymore. But I did the kind of study you never submit to NIH for a grant, and you never submit to certain kind of journals, because I did what you're told not to do. Throw a bunch of variables in and see if it works. It's also the best way to get something to work in real life, is to change a whole bunch of things at once. But it's also the worst thing for doing a study, because then you're left thinking what happened. But I had an undergrad who ended up going into orthodontry. She's now an orthodontist here in town, but she did a study with me, and we gave a number of things, including vitamin D and calcium. We also took college-age women that were active but didn't weight train, put them on a weight training program for 8 weeks, and looked at bone markers. Bone markers are not as good as looking at bone density, but you know how long it takes to do a bone density study? If you don't, let me just tell you, we're talking years, not weeks. So we use the bone markers for all their faults. They still have some value, and we use them. This is one of our results. Now, everybody in the study did the weight training program. One group got placebo, one group got the vitamin D, calcium, and a couple other things. And this is like golf. You want a low score. High score means there's more bone breakdown. So this is something called bone-specific alkaline phosphatase. And we got a pretty good decrease. This is a pretty good amount. Some things I work with, like metallothionein, this is background noise. For this measurement, that's a pretty good difference. It was about a 23% difference. So we kind of confirmed the obvious. Give people calcium, vitamin D, put them on weight training, and it's good for their bones. But you know what? I went through the literature and couldn't find anyone else that ever did that. So it was someone confirming the obvious, but we did that. We changed multiple things at the same time, and we got a decent result, but couldn't publish in a great journal because everyone was saying, well, was it this, was it that? Now, it wasn't the exercise by itself, because you see the placebo group, they went through the same exercise program, and they did not see a change. So it was at least we could narrow it down to something or some things in the intervention we gave them nutritionally. Okay, here's just a few. I'm just going to toss out some results here. I'm not going to go into any of these in detail. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of controversy as to what is a good reading for 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Okay, here's an association study that was done with stroke risk. Some of them didn't find one, some did. This one did. And I thought this one was a decent study. And they found that there was a relationship between the amount of 25-hydroxy vitamin D in either the serum or plasma, I don't remember which. And they found an association with stroke risk and did the statistics, and they looked pretty good. However, the cutoff was 20 nanograms per mil. Pretty much going above that didn't seem to add any protection. So this one is on the side of saying 30 is too high. You don't really need 30. So they came out for that one. But they did say 20 is better than 12. So at least based on this association study, that's what they said. There was another one with an intervention with blood pressure. And they took people with moderate hypertension, and they gave them a pretty hefty dose of vitamin D. They got their readings over 40. That's starting to get in the range that I get a little nervous. But they got it to 40, so they said, aha, here's one that says 30 is too low. However, I won't call it a flaw. Let's just say there's an interpretation that could be thought of here. They didn't try any lower doses of vitamin D. They only tried a dose that would get readings up above 40. Maybe if they'd have done a dose that only got their readings to 20, they would have seen an effect. Maybe 30 would have given an effect. So most of the ones that I've seen where readings got really high compared to 30, most of the studies I've seen now are studies where you ask that question, well, maybe you didn't have to go that high. So that's an issue. I'm not sold yet, as you may have already gotten the idea. I'm not sold yet. You've got to have really high levels. I haven't put that to bed yet, but as of right now, I'm not sold that there's a big advantage to going way above 30. Okay, here's an association study for blood pressure. They found 30 was the cutoff for that one to see an effect. However, I will tell you, if you have high blood pressure, this can help, but don't count on this taking you from like a 160 down to a 110. It's not going to do that. This is something that will make a modest effect at best. All right, here's another one. Bladder cancer. Association here, pretty good. This was considered a pretty good association study. But again, 20 was the cutoff for this one. Anything over 20 didn't seem to give any extra protection, at least based on this association data. Here's one, it was a supplement. They looked at people that were bordering on type 2 diabetes with their blood sugar, and they gave them a really high slug of vitamin D. Their vitamin D levels got way up there. I didn't put exactly what it was because they had multiple groups. So I'm just going to say real high, a lot more than 30. But again, they didn't try anything lower. So maybe it would have worked just as well if they'd used a lower dose. So take home here is that there's at least some reason to think that vitamin D can have some health effects, at least based on this very small cross section I've shown you. But it's still kind of up in the air as to what's the magic number you want to reach with your blood values. Most likely, and I really think this is true, most likely to be different for different effects. Some things 20 may be good enough, some things 30 may be better. I've yet to be convinced 40, 50, 60 is a good idea. At the moment, at least, I'll put me in the yet to be convinced class on that one. Here's one on fractures. Not one, but just an idea. The data is all over the place. This is looking at older people giving vitamin D and looking at fracture incidence. The studies are done all kinds of different ways, which is probably why the data is all over the place. So where are we? Here's just an opinion, straight opinion. I think there was enough positives to say it's worth trying a modest amount of vitamin D as a help. I don't think it'll be a cure-all, but I think it can help. Unfortunately, the best way it would help is if you started when the person was 2 years old, not when they were 82, but that's the way it is. If you're 82, you can't get a time machine. So I think there's enough positive to say, why not try a modest amount of vitamin D? One of the studies I kind of liked was one that was done in Australia. It was an association study. Here they found that for looking at fracture incidence, the magic number seemed to be between 24 and 29. So above the 20, getting toward the 30. But interesting with men, once you started getting much above 30, their fracture incidence actually went up. So again, there's this thing with vitamin D. It's not a case of a little is good, more is better. But again, keep in mind, that was just an association study. Another association study looked at falls, not fractures, but falls, which can overlap. There, they found that the magic range was, at least for the association, was 32 to 39. So getting above 30 again. So some of these things are saying 20 is good enough. Some are saying maybe 25. This one was saying get above 30. However, people that had readings higher than 39 started coming back down again, or it started increasing. Falls started going back up again. So again, I know a lot of this is based on association, but still, I'm again very leery of telling people they should be trying to get their numbers up super high unless I see something better than what I've seen so far. I like to be open-minded, but you got to make decisions based on what data you have right now. And based on that, I'm not a fan of going real high. Cancer is similar to the fracture situation. Again, there's very, very, very mixed results about cancer incidence or reoccurrence. But there does seem to be some association studies that have given some positive results. And the sweet spot for serum and plasma values depends on the cancer. Some just avoiding rickets is pretty good, is all it took to see some association, avoiding the really low numbers. Others getting up to 30 again was pretty good. Others 20 was good enough. So it seems to make a difference of what particular kind of cancer is being looked at. There was a small but real interesting study, I thought. It was another association study. It was done in Korea on breast cancer reoccurrence. It depended on what type of breast cancer it was, but at least for certain types, they got some pretty good differences. But again, 20 in this case was the cutoff. 20 was similar to 30. So it wasn't a huge study, but I thought it was fairly impressive despite the size. It depends on the kind of study. I've done studies with 9 people that are in a group that everybody changed when I gave them something. 9 people is enough to say something was going on. Looking at like lutein uptake, I did something with that. Other studies, though, like this, the more the merrier. So having a lot of people is a real advantage. This was not particularly big, but they did get pretty good separation. but 20 nanograms per mil was just as good as 30 in this one. So again, it seems like what the benefit is as to whether you say 20 is good enough, 25, 30. This was a cool study, I thought. It was on gingivitis. A lot of my own research has been on inflammation of some sort or another. And I've even done some exercise recovery studies, which exercise is sort of a controlled inflammation. You try to create inflammation and recover from it. So I got into exercise late in my career because of my inflammation work. Also being an ex-athlete, I just wanted to get into it. So I'm interested in inflammation. This is a gingivitis study. I thought it was kind of cool. I honestly can't evaluate all the dentistry part of it, but they convinced me they did it right. Maybe a dentist will look at it and say something different. But here, they started with people that were in their mid-20s for the nanograms per mil. So these people were not super deficient to start with. They were kind of in that mid-range where they're not deficient, but maybe not up to that 30 mark. And they only gave them 500 international units of vitamin D a day. That's not a super high dose. I mean, it's not low, but it's not super high. And I think that's equivalent of, I think 1,000 is 25 milligrams. Now a lot of the labels are not using international units anymore. They're using milligrams. I think that's about 12 and a half. I still am very geared to the IU measures, but they got their values to get up over 30. They got up to 37 nanograms per mil. And they did a measure of inflammation on a scale of 0 to 3. They got a decrease of an average of 1.4. That's a pretty good decrease when you're at a 0 to 3 scale. So I thought that was kind of cool. I also looked at some this was an intervention study. I looked at some association studies for some other inflammatory conditions. And again, it's a mixed bag, but I thought there was enough there to say, yeah, vitamin D can play a role in inflammation. That's one of the things, too, when you talk about things like these kind of essential nutrients, it's not like a drug. You just take statins, it'll lower your cholesterol. I'm fairly convinced that if you're going to do things like this, like vitamin D or eat differently, increase your fiber, it works well as a part of a general plan. And that's the worst way to get a paper published. I said earlier when we did exercise and various nutrients, I got it published, but no way I was going to get that in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition or New England Journal of Medicine with all those variables. But that's not maybe the best way to do a study to get it published, but it's sometimes the best way to actually get an effect is to do things as part of a general plan rather than a magic bullet sort of a philosophy. But that was, I thought, kind of a cool study. All right, I'm about done. And so I should have plenty of time for questions. What about toxic effects? Back when I was young and my heart was just an open book, and I used to say live and let live, way back when I was an assistant professor, when I was trying to fill in the 15 to 20 minutes on vitamin D in the general nutrition course, I would talk briefly about toxicity. And what would I say? I'd say, yeah, toxicity causes you to get calcification in the soft tissues. That's a fancy way of saying you get calcium when you don't want it in high amounts. But you're not gonna. This isn't gonna happen to you. You really can't do it from the sun because you run out of the compound that the sun has to hit. So you might sunburn, you might get skin cancer, but you probably won't get vitamin D toxicity from too much sun. And to do this with pills, you really got to take a lot of pills. So I thought, I'm going to tell you about this and then tell you probably none of you will ever experience it. That was the old line. However, I'm really now starting to become convinced that toxicity can happen sooner than that in terms of sooner or at a lower dose, maybe is a better way of putting it. I already talked about how, at least for some studies, we get reduced effects of vitamin D when things get too high, where it goes up and then starts coming back down again. That's, I think, is a form of toxicity. There's also some bad effects seen at some lower doses. This is just a few examples. For instance, in one study when 2,800 IUs were given, which I know loads of people taking 5,000, 10,000 a day, in this study, their cholesterol and triglycerides went up. They didn't go up like 20 units, but they went up enough that I wouldn't want it to happen if it was my cholesterol readings. Another one, this was done in MS patients. I don't know what would happen in anybody else because nobody's tested in anybody else. But in people with multiple sclerosis, they gave 4,370 IUs, and it lowered their melatonin production. So that's not a super high dose compared to what a lot of people take. I personally, I had mine, a lot of times I'd have my lab tech measure things in the lab on my blood, or I'd go in and measure things. I never did 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and my prime care person one day said, "You want it measured?" I said, "Yeah, why not?" And it came back barely above rickets levels. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that. Maybe I have a little bit of an absorption problem with it, but and I don't get sun because I've had some AKs on my face, so I'm not big on getting too much sun. So I just started with 1,000 international units a day, took it with a fatty meal, and it took a while. I eventually got up to 30, decided that was good enough. That's where I would plateau, and that's where I've stayed. But it took a while doing 1,000. 1,000 was as much as I was comfortable with, but again, I know people that are taking way, way more than that. So in MS patients, at least in this study, it was not a huge study, but a well-done one, and a little over 4,000 was enough to lower melatonin production. Another study, they gave 10,000 units plus 1,000, I think 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. Guess what went up? Kidney stone risk. I've had a couple of them. I hope I never have another one. I'm doing everything I can not to. So they got the readings up to greater than 80 nanograms per mil. And lo and behold, when they did that, they found they did this over a several-year period, and they found the higher incidence of kidney stones of the people getting that. And I'm not all that surprised. It does help. I know some people think, well, if you have calcium oxalate kidney stones, you want to not eat much calcium. That's actually not correct, because if you don't eat much calcium, you're going to take it out of your bone, and you may end up with more calcium in your urine than if you were eating a decent amount of calcium. You want to eat an appropriate amount of calcium. However, in this case, they took people who are already eating a fair amount of calcium, gave them even more, and then gave them this really huge slug of vitamin D. I think taking 1,000 units of vitamin D will not give people kidney stones, but that was not 1,000 units. That's 10 times as much. So here's another one. This was done in Estonia, and they took some young adult men that had never lifted weights and told them, the difference between a curl and a press. And no, it has nothing to do with fashion or hairstyles. And they did this weight training, and they did 7 tests of strength increase. And they found that when they gave them only 1 level of supplements. They didn't give them a dose response thing. And the level they were giving them got their blood values up to 57. And they actually found that for 2 of the strength tests, they actually improved less if they took the vitamin D than they did if they hadn't. They just did the weight training by itself. But again, they're getting these levels up very high. So I'm just not a fan of going above 30 at the moment. If somebody does some study and convinces me otherwise, I'll look into it. But at the moment, I'm feeling like most of the things I'm seeing, 30 seems to be, or maybe just a little above 30 seems to be good enough. Some of them, 20 seems to be good enough. And I'm not convinced that the higher levels do anything more. I think most of the studies I've seen so far, there's a few more I'd still like to look at in more detail. Most of the studies I'm seeing where they get the real high levels, even if they're showing a benefit, they haven't shown that they couldn't have got that with a lower increase. So that's kind of where I am. So toxicity may not require these. Yeah, the classical toxicity where you get a calcification of the tissues, you might have to really clean out the vitamin D bottle for that. But some lower doses might still have some negative effects. So my conclusion, I'm going to cite the Apostle Paul from one of his letters that's in the Bible. I can't remember anymore what opinion he was giving, but he was talking on a certain subject, and he said, "I say this, not God." So my conclusion is I'm saying this, not God. It's subject to revision as I get more data, but based on what I'm seeing right at the moment, as you probably have already guessed, I would say it wouldn't hurt anybody to aim for 30 milligrams. Not milligrams, that'd poison you. 30 nanogram per mil readings. I don't think that hurts anything. It may be more than you need for some effects, but it may be an appropriate amount for some other things. And I'd be cautious about anything that takes you over 40. So as of this moment, that is my opinion and what I recommend.
Thank you very much. I think that was brought to a level all of us can understand. I really appreciate that. All right, we're open for comments or questions. Yeah, we'll try and use the microphones too, so our Zoom audience can hear everything.
Yeah, I just checked my OSU My chart, and I'm at a 42 right now. And I'm not so much concerned about that. Actually, if you look at OSU's My chart, they want 30 to 100 is optimal. 10 to 29 is insufficient, and less than 10 is deficient. But I'm asking this, the study on the bone fracture, I just had a hyperparathyroidism surgery, so I've been following calcium and parathyroid. And in that bone study, you did the vitamin, or they did the vitamin D, but did they look at anything with hyperparathyroid? Because parathyroid hormone is a big controller of that bone density.
Some did, some didn't.
Okay.
So that's the problem with this. It's such a mishmash out there. But I know when we gave vitamin D, I'm trying to think if we saw any PTH difference, and we measured it, and I can't recall what we got. I know for one of our studies with weight loss, we measured parathyroid where we didn't get an improvement in weight loss with the extra calcium or dairy. We gave it either as a supplement or as extra dairy. And we didn't get any more weight loss. We did see a better preservation of some of the bone marker readings. But I think there we did get a little bit of an effect on parathyroid, if I remember right.
Well, I was thinking more of if they're trying to conclude that it was the vitamin D that had these effects, these people could have had a different, it could have really been correlated with their parathyroid hormone levels more than actual vitamin D potentially.
Yeah, and that's the problem. There's just so much going on for a lot of these things.
Thank you. I was grateful that as a non-scientist, I could understand that. There's been a lot of, sort of in my world, discussion in recent years about whether to focus or not focus on D3. What is D3?
D3 is pretty much the one that's sold most places now. That's one of the reasons they used to use IUs. Usually IUs are used where there's multiple forms of a nutrient. So like for vitamin A, you could get it as beta carotene that's made into vitamin A or retinol. And so if you just use a unit of weight, it's not really telling you all you need to know because there's different activity levels of these different things because some of them have to be converted in the body and that sort of thing. Now that most of the pills are all using D3, they're kind of going back to milligrams now and not the IUs because that's pretty much most of what you're going to find. I've not seen a whole lot of anything else. Now, there is a prescription vitamin D that's in the active hormone form. It's extremely potent. So my son used to work as a chemist for Boehringer Ingelheim. And he used to wear gloves and masks and everything else when he used to do some of the quality control measurements on it because it's just so potent that it can be very poison. But it's usually given to people that have a very hard time converting the vitamin D into one of the active hormones. But that you can only get by prescription. There is this form that it comes out of Worcester, Ohio, and it's real vitamin D, but they mix it with some things to give it this structure. It's those of you who've had some chemistry, it's kind of a micelle where it has some water-like properties and some fat-like properties, so it can disperse in the water. They originally did this for food science purposes, so you could throw this in like a vitamin water and not get a cloudy mess. But then they've decided, gee, maybe we should start doing some nutrition stuff. They've done very little with the vitamin D. As I said, I'm using it now in a CF study. Probably the average person wouldn't benefit from it, but if someone has a problem like fat malabsorption, if you ever see the commercials on TV for Cunol, they have a cardiologist come out and say, I tell my patients on statins to take CoQ10, and I recommend Cunol because it's absorbed better. None of that's published. It's made by this company in Worcester. And I'm using that in my CF study because for them, CoQ10 is essential like, and they have trouble absorbing fat. So I'm using it for them. The average person, I did a study with 99%, it's not published, but 99% pure CoQ10, and just told the people, take it with a fatty meal, and they absorbed it wonderfully. I think the quinol, they gave it on an empty stomach and looked at a 2-hour absorption and said it absorbs better. I think that's, I won't dispute the data, but I would dispute their conclusion. So in any event, for the vitamin D, I don't know that they're selling it anywhere, but for some people that have a fat malabsorption problem, it's D3, but it's mixed in with some other things, that natural products that help it disperse in water. But for the most part, I think D3 is pretty much all that's sold without a prescription. I haven't noticed anything else. Yeah.
We have a question up above. Does Gilbert syndrome play a role in this research?
I am not familiar. I know of the thing. You're an MD. Do you know what?
Yeah. I remember learning about that years ago. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to plead ignorance on this one. I know a lot of syndromes, but I don't know that one.
Amy, do you want to fill in your chat box and tell us what Gilbert syndrome is? Or video? We're not hearing you.
Okay.
Audio is probably silent. So if you want to type it in, we can get back to that.
Okay, maybe we can come back to that because I'm sorry. I don't know.
Any other comment or question?
I have a question.
Yep.
I have had a doctor for many years. She was an osteopathic doctor who was holistically trained. And she, when she saw my vitamin D levels and also the fact that I was getting a lot of upper respiratory infections, she recommended I take a certain amount, and it's in the thousands. I now have had on a regular basis over 550 for years. And so what I'm wondering, because you haven't really talked about it, you talked about many studies. What about immunity? I really feel that the biggest benefit I've had no colds since I started on that.
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and I just couldn't hit. Something that's really worth subscribing to is something called Consumer Labs, and they do a lot with supplements, but they do other things too. They talk about contaminants in dental floss and things like that, and they're a pretty good group. One of the things they do is pull supplements off the shelves and say whether what's on the label is really there. They'll tell you things about which fish oils have mercury, but they also do other stuff. They talk about a lot of other things, you know, like your shampoos and things, what's good. And it's called Consumer Lab. It costs something to subscribe. I don't remember what it is, but it's not exorbitant. That's a really good place to go. But they, and I said, they're not limited to nutrition or supplements, but that's kind of their specialty area. But when I went through and was looking, they had something called, in their vitamin D review, they had something called What It Does. And I gave up counting at about 35, all the different things they were talking about on there. There was so much on there, so I had to pick a few areas. But yeah, I think the immunity one is interesting. One thing about immunity and nutrition in general, I think it's a body system that can most respond to small changes in nutrient status. I don't know if that's because we have good ways of measuring it so we can detect small differences, or whether it's just a very sensitive system. But I've just noticed that in many areas, like some zinc work I've done, that mild zinc deficiency, the first thing that seems to be changed is the immune system. So I will say that. I think the immune system seems to be the part of the body that is perhaps most sensitive to even mild changes in nutrient status.
Let me point out that anecdotal evidence like that is really useful for constructing hypotheses, but it's not useful for making any kind of conclusions, say, about immunity or anything like that. So if you saw that kind of effect anecdotally, you could say, oh, this is interesting. I wonder if it applies to a large group of people. Let's set up a test to test that hypothesis, whether it really does it or not. So we use anecdotal evidence to establish hypotheses that can then be tested, not to make conclusions in the first place. Back to Gilbert syndrome. Now that Amy put that up there, I do remember Gilbert syndrome is a inherited disease that causes hyperbilirubinemia that's normal for the person that gets it. It affects the liver's ability to process bilirubin, and the treatment for it is vitamin D, which I did not know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I could say something else. You've told me more than I know about it. So I'm sorry I can't add to that.
It's interesting because the liver is a source of vitamin D, as I recall.
Right, that's a main
So-
storage site. So
Yeah, so that probably affects vitamin D's production. And interesting.
and vitamin D can be anti-inflammatory, so that might help a little bit with liver inflammation, which I know Billy Rubin can rise in regard to that. But
Is there any relationship between K2 and vitamin D?
yeah, I put that up on the slide. That the slide I said is more than you can read. The time I'm going to leave it up.
And specifically
Kate.
what?
Yeah, K2 is interesting. I'm still evolving my opinion on it. Most of the vitamin K we eat in foods, particularly plant foods, is K1. So go have a romaine lettuce salad, you're going to get a pretty good amount of K1, which K stands for clotting. Now I know it begins with a C, but in another language it begins with a K. And at one time, that was mostly what we talked about with vitamin K was clotting, but we are seeing that vitamin K does some other things. K2 is a different form of vitamin K. It's found in some animal products. You can also buy it as a supplement. Some of it gets converted over to regular vitamin K, but some of it is able to do other things. And bone health is one of the areas people have been looking at, but there's some others as well that it might do. It's a little bit like beta carotene in carrots and some plant foods. Some of it gets converted to vitamin A. When I first started teaching, we said, and the other 5, 6 just goes down the drain. Then we started saying, well, it's not an essential nutrient, the rest of it, but it might have some beneficial effects. K2 is kind of landing in that area too, where some of it gets converted to normal vitamin K, but some of it may go off and do something else. And I'm still in the process of evaluating it, but I went from I don't care to I'm interested. I'll say that.
For the reason I'm asking the question, there's a recently published paper that vitamin K2 has a salutary effect in diminishing leg cramps.
Leg cramps, okay.
And I was wondering if you had any
I
information
have
to
not
that.
read that particular study. I've looked a little at magnesium, and it seems like maybe yes, maybe no, depends on the person kind of thing. But I haven't read about the K2 particularly. And sometimes iron deficiency. Some people can be terribly iron deficient and not get leg cramps, but some people do. So I've looked a little at leg cramps, but haven't with K2. But I've gone to, as I said, disinterested to interested for K2.
First, thank you for an excellent and frankly, regrettably persuasive presentation. And I wish I hadn't been so persuaded by it because it comes back to the first questioner's question. My primary care physician is an OSU professor, and she is deeply wedded to the MyChart numbers, which are 30 to 100. That was my recollection as well. And she said, 65's in the middle, but let's try to get you as close to 100 as we can. So I have 2 questions. First of all, where do the MyChart numbers come from that at least one OSU professor feels is definitive? And secondly, how does one reconcile this when one is in the position I'm in?
I'm not sure about MyChart. I know for a lot of the places you go online that are actually medical places, not, Joe in his basement. A lot of times they call, what they call normal range tends to be more average range. It's what people end up at. It's not necessarily optimal. It drives me nuts sometimes with copper. Some of the lower ends, I have a lot of roots in copper research. What they call the normal range, that lower range, I would call deficient. But it's sort of a typical range is what it is. And I think, if you went back 10 years, that would not be a typical range. But now with more and more people taking really high doses. So I think a lot of times what they're calling normal is more maybe better defined as typical.
Yeah, I think he's right there. That's a really important point. Those are the average ranges established on large numbers of people that they do the test on. That doesn't mean those are necessarily the desirable ranges, but that's what most people are at. So there's a big difference. Yeah, very different. I have to agree with you. This was pretty convincing. I'm going to be at 30.
Again, I'm saying that's as of today.
That's fine.
This is.
When I go in next month for my annual physical, we're going at 30.
Subject to revision if I learn more, but that's what I'm feeling as of the moment. And that's all you can do.
Any other comments or questions? Dr. Silvestro, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Keep-